My name is Emory Young,
I'm William Pinson.
And I'm Mauli Bhogade.
and we are Wyrm Environmental Solutions, also known as Brawl Buddies.
Okay, so first to define the problem. So for our problem statement, as of 2019, extruded polystyrene foam products made up roughly 30% of landfill waste across the US, and this number is expected to rise as polystyrene does not naturally break down, leading to pollution and contamination. So for our purpose of our project is to design and test a process to decrease and dispose of the volume of extruded polystyrene foam in Florida landfills in an environmentally sustainable way. So we're not focusing on the logistical side on collecting pickup. We're slowly looking at the process of turning the styrofoam into a usable material for plants. The collection process would be a further implementation step that would be done after this project.
So some key research that we kind of started off with was the direct costs of styrofoam production are relatively inexpensive. Because of this, it's very proficient throughout the shipping industries and the consumer food use, such as styrofoam cups. 25 to 35% by volume of landfills are composed of polystyrene products. And so that means about 10 cubic feet of volume taken up for every 10,000 cups in a landfill. 18% of total coastal cleanup costs are attributed to polystyrene products, and 14 million tons of polystyrene are produced every year around the world.
For our survey, the main purpose for our survey was to see how often people use styrofoam in their everyday lives, and also to see how willing people would be to drop off their styrofoam at a designated location. That way we could collect it for our process. For the laws, codes, and regulations, we didn't really have any that necessarily applied to us, only because our system was turning something inorganic into an organic material. Most of the laws and codes mostly apply to either specifically organic or inorganic, and not necessarily going from one to another.
Okay, so looking at our existing solutions at the beginning of our process, the first solution is obviously landfills. This is where styrofoam is placed as of now. You throw it away in the trash truck takes it to the landfill, and it's disposed. However, the problem with this is that styrofoam has such a low density and is so large that it takes up a large amount of space. So that's not very viable. The second solution was from Ashton Coffer. He designed a small experiment that applied heat, time, and chemicals to styrofoam, and then it would create activated carbon. However, this is not very implementable on a large scale, and we're not sure how well it works. There was no efficiency rating for it. The third solution is D-liminin. This is a citric based product, and it basically digests the styrofoam. However, with this, it's very citric and very acidic. So whenever you apply it to the styrofoam, it's not very good for the environment. And then the fourth one is incineration of polystyrene foam, basically burning the styrofoam. With this, again, it causes a lot of byproducts that are not necessarily good for the earth or good for human breathing. And then the next one was a GreenMax foam recycling machine. So what this does is it shreds the polystyrene up and then compresses it. But the thing with this is that the GreenMax is very expensive and it doesn't get rid of the styrofoam, it just compresses it. We were looking to turn it into a usable material. With plasma gasification, it applies high heat and turns the styrofoam into almost a sludge. However, with this, it's very harmful for workers to be around it, and it also produces a lot of harmful byproducts. And then the last one was biodegradable foam. This was a new concept made. Packing peanuts can degrade without harm into the environment. However, this takes a long time, for example, a couple of years. So it's not very viable in terms of length span. And then what we did with these solutions was we created a decision matrix looking at our different criteria. But with these solutions, while they did solve some problems, they also fell or were faulty in other things. So for example, with plasma gasification, it's a very quick process, a very quick turnabout. However, the impact on the global environment is very low. It's not good for the environment as well. So we are looking for a solution that has a solution that's globally environmentally friendly and also efficient.
So some of our design constraints to begin with, we had 8 criteria, which you kind of just saw with the previous solutions. The first one being performance, and these are ranked in terms of, just kind of the performance. We wanted to make sure that the designs and the solutions, they actually solve the problem, right? They actually effectively and efficiently and environmentally friendly break down this this polystyrene. The global environment, that one was a key one for us. We wanted to make sure that it doesn't contribute negatively to the environment while also trying to help the environment. We're trying to remove polystyrene from landfills, so there shouldn't be a negative byproduct as a result of that. Efficiency, we wanted to make sure that this could be done in a timely manner simply because of the amount of volume that it takes up in the landfills. Scalability, as previously mentioned, there's so much of it in landfills that would have to be scaled to a really high degree in order to make sure that it would effectively account for the amount that's in styrofoam or in landfills. Sorry. The cost, we wanted to make sure that this was cost efficient, as in order for things to be successful, they have to be cost efficient and cost effective. The service life, we wanted to make sure that something would last a long time and would be able to handle this for years to come, because at the current rate, we're not really slowing down our styrofoam consumption. The operating environment and the maintenance kind of go hand in hand. We wanted to make sure that whatever workers that had to be there were safe, and also that it required low maintenance and low upkeep. Now, our design requirements, aka our constraints, we want to make sure that we successfully and safely biodegrade extruded polystyrene foam with worms. So obviously we did some research into that as well. We decided we wanted to use worms, most notably super worms, to help solve this problem. We wanted to produce a safe and usable compost or fertilizer as an end product. So we wanted to take styrofoam, which is toxic and pretty much non-usable, and turn it into something usable and also good for the environment. And then we also want to emphasize that we were developing an industrial process, not a sellable product. So you'll see later on in our solutions, but we just wanted to emphasize that we were designing the process that would be undergone instead of an actual product that someone would necessarily buy. So for our solution, we started off, we had 3 original concepts. The first one was the tiered digestion system. And so this was a 3-tiered system, kind of like a chest of drawers, where you had worms at the top, worms at the middle, and a collection system at the bottom. And the worms would eat the styrofoam, it would fall down, get eaten again, and then fall down to an access drawer, which would kind of collect this. So the pros were ease of maintenance. It was compact. There's very few moving parts, and it was easily environmentally controlled. The cons, however, was it was kind of hard to control the distribution of the EPS, which is again extruded polystyrene foam. There were additional inputs required, so you might have to break down the foam or process it beforehand. And also, we had questions about how could you scale this to a large scale. So that was kind of our first solution.
For the second solution, we had the grinding system. So basically, the styrofoam would go on the top, get shredded, and then go to the worms, and then it'd be collected at the bottom. Some of the positives of this was that the grinding system would allow for the distribution and the decreased size of the styrofoam, which would make it easier for the worms to digest. However, it also can be seen as more moving parts, more that can go wrong with the system.
And then for our third concept, it's a sifting system. So with this, we kind of made a horizontal version. So the goal in this was to increase the surface area with the worms to the styrofoam so that you were being as efficient as possible. So you would have a rotating mechanism and you would insert the styrofoam at the top and then have the worms. And then as it goes down the styrofoam, slowly over time, the pieces will fall from the mesh into the container for it. So the pros of this are that it's really easy to remove and clean the collection drawer just because it's underneath the mechanism. And then the movement also provides an even distribution of EPS because you can just move it if you feel like if some worms are more on one side than the other. And then it also can handle large volumes of EPS because you can scale it to such a large volume. However, with the cons of this are that there's a lot of safety concerns in rotating and moving worms. There's no testing on whether the worms would survive through the rotations, and it's also hard to insert and manage the EPS while it's in the system itself. And then looking at this, we did a decision matrix based on our criteria, and it turned out the tiered digestive system had the highest total just because of the performance, efficiency, and how it was environmentally friendly. It had the 2-layer system so that our final product would be the usable fertilizer for plants that we could extract and use.
So for the final concept, we combined some of the best aspects of each of the 3. So we used the tiered aspect from the first concept, the grinding from the second, and the collection for the third. Also, we'll have better better maintenance and hopefully scalability.
All right, so to begin, you can see that on the backside we have this grinder here that's attached to this plywood backboard with the tiered digestion system here. So the grinder has a funnel in which the styrofoam would be placed in and then would be ground up. You can see kind of right here, there's a channel that would funnel the styrofoam into the first layer of worms. There, the styrofoam would be placed, the worms would eat it, and then they would fall to the second level. The second level, the styrofoam would be digested again before it would drop into that third level, which kind of has this canvas bag in which all of it would be allowed to be collected. You can see there's ventilation on all sides of it, which would allow for airflow and environmental control. And also we have this backboard here to provide structural support just because the grinder would be relatively heavy.
So for the build procedures, our main aspects were the tiered system, which we are using plastic stacking drawers, the support, which would be made of the plywood, the grinding system, which we purchased a fruit crusher, and then the worms themselves, and as well as fasteners. All the tools we were planning on using we would have access to through our building construction teacher, Mr. Thompson, which sadly got cut short and we were unable to access due to COVID. So for our procedures, we first wanted to cut out 2 holes on each of the 3 tiers in order to allow for the ventilation, since the worms had to be well kept in a certain environment. Then we wanted to cut out the back of the top drawer to allow for the styrofoam to flow in, and then we cut out the bottom to mesh later on to allow for the passing out through the levels. So here we can see we added the mesh on the first 2 layers, and then on the last layer we added a canvas bag to allow for the collection. And then once you do that, we restack the 3 layers, and then we're done with the tiered part. Next, we're going to work on the grind sub-assembly. So we remove the funnel that the fruit crusher comes with, and we cut off one of the faces. That way we can keep it flush against the plywood support. Then we cut a hole in the plywood support to allow for the styrofoam to go through. And then using the material from the funnel, the piece that we cut off, create a little channel that allows for the passing of styrofoam. Once you assemble those using our fasteners, you secure the whole thing together. At this point, we weren't sure if we would have needed more support on the bottom. That was something we were going to actually assemble and then see if we needed to add any.
So now for testing, once we created our model, we decided how we should test it. So we originally had 5 different testings. So the first one was determining the size that the grinder produces the EPS foam, the density of the pre versus post grinder EPS. The third one is the test that we actually went through with. This is the rate at which the worms can consume the EPS foam. So is the worms actually a viable solution in decomposing the foam? And then the fourth one was determining the mesh, if the output gets stuck between the layers, and if the graded styrofoam is going through the mesh, but the worms are still staying above them. And then the last one would be the final unit volume over unit time ratio and the percent converted ratio for the overall system. So again, we had 5 points, and these were all quantitative. So we wanted to test to see if the size was consistent, if the density wasn't changed. And then we ended up doing the third step, which Emory will later describe on. But if we were to go further with our experiment, then we would have done the other 4.
So these are our testing procedures for what Mauli just mentioned. And so obviously we weren't able to construct the system due to COVID-19. So instead we were forced to kind of scale and kind of reshift our focus to, instead of saying what could the system look like and how efficient is it as a system, we decided to only look at the process of worms consuming the styrofoam. So these are all of the testing procedures for those previous ones. Oops. These are all the testing procedures for the previous ones. So all we're looking at now is the rate at which the worms can consume. So this is what we would have done. However, we ended up doing just this. So what we were focusing on was finding the rate of consumption by superworms and also by mealworms. So these are our kind of procedures. The first one we had to do was purchase the worms. Then we wanted to divide them into containers with blocks of EPS foam. So we wanted to make sure that the foam that we were using was characteristic of what most people would have in their house. So we used packaging foam, stuff that was found from a printer package. We calculated the density ahead of time just by cutting out a block of foam, weighing it, and also finding the volume. Then we place the worms with the following groupings. We use 10, 20, 30, and 40. Then we cover these containers with plastic wrap and punch holes. Then you water them daily. And after 7 days, you're going to take the block of foam. You're going to remove any worms. You're going to weigh it. Now, assuming that there are still worms inside, because there most likely would be, you break it open and remove any worms. You find the weight of those worms that removed. Then you calculate the actual weight of the leftover foam just by subtracting that. Then you calculate the difference in weight from the beginning, and using the density, you find the difference in volume. So doing that, then you can find with the associated number of worms, 10, 20, 30, or 40, the time frame of 7 days, and the difference in weight, and therefore volume. You can calculate a unit in inches cubed per day per worm. You can do the same thing for the mealworms, except this time we did 220 mealworms, and we did the blockings as 20, 40, 60, and 100. Quick note, the reason we did those numbers was simply due to the availability. The supplier that we purchased from did not have very many superworms for sale, simply because of quarantine, and so therefore 100 superworms was as much as we could get. 200 mealworms was actually as much as we could get, but there happened to be 20 extra ones. As part of the results, sadly, out of the 100 that were purchased for the superworms, only 67 of them were alive. So we then decided to transfer the groupings to 10, 20, and 37. So to begin with, after the results, in the containers with 10, 20, and 37 worms, 2 had died in the 10 container, 2 had died in the 20 container, and 0 had died in the 37 worm container. We contacted the supplier to see what was up. They said that the recent shipment of worms had not been in great shape, and also there could have been unforeseen environmental impacts. The suppliers recommended that you keep the worms indoors, dark, damp temperatures, roughly 70 to 80 degrees, and where they were located was dark and damp, and it fluctuated between 70 to 75. However, the outdoor temperatures fluctuated greatly, and we were not able to monitor the room the entire time. To add to this, some worms did die, but we decided not to let this alter the final consumption rates. Some people could argue that because we had 10 worms to begin with, but only 8 that survived the experiment, we should calculate the rates of consumption using 8 worms instead of 10. However, we decided to leave it at the 10 mark just because in reality, later on an industrial scale, it's reasonable to assume that worms would perish anyway. As for the mealworms, sadly, by the end of the experiment, many of them had died. This was most notable in the containers with 20 and 40 mealworms. Quite a few had died. Same thing with the 100 mealworms as well, although not as many. The pet store that we purchased them from recommended refrigerating the worms to extend their lifespan. So a lot of pet owners will put them in the refrigerator until they're willing to feed them. And this puts them in a comatose state. However, because we wanted to keep them in the same environment as the superworms to test what that would look like, that might have been why some of them died, or it could have been from the condition that they were shipped from the supplier. On the contrary, though, the mealworms ate hardly as much EPS foam as the superworms. In fact, it was so little that when I went to weigh them, there was no difference in weight from the original styrofoam to the new ones. And because of this, we decided that we could not use this data as there was no true significant numbers to be had. So we had to scrap the experiment with the mealworms. So for the superworms, we calculated that the 10 superworms consumed 2 grams, and you can see the original results and the calculations on the right. So over here, we have 0.256 grams per cubic inch. That was the density of the styrofoam to begin with. And so after 1 week, they ate 2 grams. So doing some math, we were able to calculate that one individual worm would eat 0.1116 cubic inches per day. With the 20 superworms, they ate 4 grams, so reasonably it was the same exact rate, 0.1116 inches cubed per day per worm. And then for the 37 worms, they actually ate 8 grams in 7 days, so their rate was 0.12 inches cubed per day. So again, the image to the right shows this calculations. For the mealworms, again, as previously stated, the amount of EPS foam consumed by the mealworms was not significant, and so we couldn't measure it, and again, the test results were scrapped. So here are some pictures. This is just a plastic container containing the styrofoam. This was the day they were placed on there. Again, you can kind of see some of the mealworms weren't in the great shape. They were all alive when I put them in there, except for the ones that had died before they were placed in there. And a few of them had died throughout the experiment, but for the most part, they stayed relatively healthy. Here you can see this is when I broke apart the styrofoam to measure it, to see how many were left inside. They dug quite a few channels, and they're known to be burrowers. At the top right, you can see this is where they were held in a dark room. There's a light on at the moment, but without the light, it would be pitch black. And in the bottom right here, you can see how much of the styrofoam was actually ground down into this excrement product that would later be processed. So to analyze the testing, it must first be noted that mealworms and superworms are two different species. Neither of them are actually worms. They're actually the larva stage of a unique species of darkling beetles. And the most notable difference to any person is their size. Superworms are 1.5 to 2 inches and quite thick compared to the mealworms, which are only 0.5 to 1 inch on average. So again, with the mealworms, so you can see at the bottom, we decided to scrap their data, so their rate of consumption, we weren't able to calculate. However, the results graphed on the right demonstrates the rate of consumption for 10, 20, and 37 worms with their trend line here. Due to our limited number of worms, we weren't able to figure out what this would look like on a large scale. Our initial goal was to determine to see if that rate was linear, exponential, or logarithmic. So in the bottom right corner here, you can see, perhaps it was linear and the 0.112 was just an error and it should have been 0.116 or 1116 for all numbers of worms. Or it could be positive and linear. Additionally, it could be exponential and, maybe because of their behavioral aspects, the more worms you have, the more they eat. Or most likely, it could be logarithmic, where you have positive returns as you increase the number of worms up to a certain point, and then you have diminishing returns. So again, we were able to then average it and say superworms consume EPS foam at roughly 0.114 inches cubed per day per worm. And this proved that superworms are also more effective than mealworms, given the environmental settings that they were in. We're assuming we did something wrong, or that maybe mealworms, you need more of them to consume to sustain. However, given our experiment and the environment they were kept in, it was proved that superworms were more effective than mealworms.
Okay.
Ultimately, our team was unable to build what we originally hoped to, but we were at least able to prove the idea that we can reduce the amount of styrofoam in landfills. At least in small scales, we saw that superworms were much more efficient than the mealworms. And so at least we were able to ultimately prove that that the idea of using superworms to decrease the amount of styrofoam in landfills has some merit.
So for reflection, looking forward into improvements, we would continue the building process, testing the grinder and the subsystems in our tiered level. We would also like to test a larger quantity of worms to eliminate variability. So for example, testing 1,000 worms, 2,000, to see the full scale of the graph. And then we would also test over a long period of time. We only did this for a week due to time constraints, but ideally we would test over a month so that we could expand the data. And then we would also have worms be sprayed with the hormone chemicals that Emory talked about. And then we would also test variability in different environments, such as heating it, providing different moisture levels, or having different airflows. And we would also test with different densities and forms of EPS foam. For example, maybe grinding it to different densities or seeing how well the worms did with grinded styrofoam versus packaged styrofoam.
And real quick to add on that, I'm not sure if I did touch on the hormone chemicals or not, but the suppliers that we purchased from weren't the ones that we were originally intending to do so. There are certain suppliers that spray the larva with hormone chemicals to delay them turning into the darkling beetles. So this keeps them alive for longer and allows them to, have a longer lifespan to feed to pets or to have your own superworm farm. And so for us to do a longer period experiment, we would just use these worms as opposed to the ones you would purchase from your average pet store. As for our goals, if we were to continue, the one thing that we kind of raised one of the questions we raised, was to see what would happen to the worms after consumption of polystyrene. So again, superworms are a very common pet food. So could pets still safely consume them after they've eaten so much styrofoam? Would their chemical makeup change, or would they be toxic, considering they eat so much styrofoam? Also, if the worms perish, could they be used in the fertilizer? Is there something that you can do with them when they're dead? So just something to consider, because obviously these worms do not have as long of a lifespan. It's generally 1 year, again, if they're sprayed with these chemicals. So what can you do with them? Exploring the use of the excrement, we wanted to see maybe we could mix it with water, heat it up, and inoculate it with soil to help turn it into fertilizer. Just because, again, what we collected still resembled styrofoam, although that's not to say that something organic didn't happen. And also we would test it with plants to see what the fertilizer would turn into. and if it was good for the plants. And lastly, and one most importantly, is to scale it up to an industrial level. So we had this physical model that we would use to test an industrial process on a small scale. So that would be the first thing, would to be build and test that physical model. And then also would be to determine the conditions and the regulations and what an industrial setting using these worms would look like, both to ensure efficiency and safety for the workers and worms. So these are our references for throughout the project. And thank you. So if you have any questions, please reach out to me at my email there. On behalf of Wyrm Environmental Solutions, we say thank you.